April 1945. The air over Western Germany hung thick with smoke and silence. Columns of beaten German soldiers trudged along a dirt road, helmets dangling from trembling hands, uniforms torn and filthy. The war they'd sworn to win was over. The Rye had collapsed. Behind them, the black plumes of burning towns twisted into the gray sky. Ahead, the distant sound of trucks, voices, and the foreign rhythm of American boots. The Wehrmacht men expected hatred, gunfire, revenge. For years, propaganda had warned them. The Americans would show no mercy. Then, something impossible happened. As they entered a small town near the Rhine, American civilians stood in the doorways. Farmers, mothers, children, silent, pale from rationing, yet steady in their gaze. One woman stepped forward. In her hands, a loaf of bread. She didn't speak. She simply held it out. The German sergeant hesitated, unable to move. The war had taught him to fear bullets, not kindness. The bread trembled between them, a gesture more terrifying than any weapon. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was disintegrating. Adolf Hitler's thousand-year Reich had collapsed into rubble in barely 12 years. Allied forces pressed in from every direction. The Soviets from the east, the Americans, British, and French from the west. Cities that once stood as symbols of German pride were now smoldering ruins. Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, names that echoed destruction. For the ordinary German soldier, the illusion of victory had long since died. What remained was fear, not only of the relentless Allied advance, but of what would happen when the end finally came. For months, Nazi propaganda had filled their ears with horror stories. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and officers warned them that Americans were monsters, that capture meant torture, humiliation, death. The enemy, they were told, would show no pity. Every retreating unit was reminded that surrender was treason. Better to fight to the last bullet. Better to die a soldier than be devoured by the enemy's revenge. But as the Reich crumbled, those orders lost meaning. German divisions were dissolving into chaos. Communications collapsed, fuel ran dry, rations disappeared. Commanders were either dead or surrendering themselves. On the front lines, many soldiers found themselves wandering through the shattered countryside, trying to find anyone still wearing the same uniform. The Americans, meanwhile, were advancing with speed and precision. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's forces had crossed the Rhine in March, a feat that signaled the final death blow to German resistance in the West. In the Ardennes, the last desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge, had failed miserably. What followed was not just a military collapse, but a psychological one. Entire German units surrendered without firing a shot. Yet despite the surrendering soldiers' fear of punishment, the American response was unexpectedly measured. Orders from the highest levels of command emphasized discipline, restraint, and humanity. Eisenhower understood something few commanders in history ever did. Brutality in victory could breed resentment for generations. Mercy could shape peace. Still, on both sides, emotions ran deep. Many American troops had seen comrades die at Normandy, in the Hürtgen Forest, and across the Siegfried Line. They had every reason to hate the men now marching toward them with hands raised. The war in Europe had revealed the full extent of Nazi atrocities, the concentration camps, the mass graves, the destruction of entire populations. For civilians in Allied territories, the hatred of the German uniform was almost instinctive. And yet, when the moment of truth came, something different unfolded. As the Allies swept into German villages, they didn't find the fanatical resistance they had been warned of. They found starvation, civilians hiding in cellars, children who had never seen a day without sirens, and soldiers, not warriors anymore, but young men barely standing, terrified of what awaited them. The Americans were under strict orders: take prisoners, process them humanely, and keep advancing. Every captured soldier was one less gun to fight. The United States Army was vast, well-supplied, and, unlike the Wehrmacht, driven by a code of conduct that drew from democracy rather than ideology. Still, the scene was surreal. For years, Germans had been told the Americans were savages. Yet here they were, giving captured men water, cigarettes, sometimes even food. There was no gunfire, no revenge, no execution lines, just quiet efficiency. That quiet shocked them more than any battle ever had. When German troops marched into occupied France or Poland, they left behind burned towns and dead civilians. They expected nothing less in return. But the Americans, their supposed enemies, behaved differently. The confrontation that should have been filled with rage became instead a mirror, reflecting back the moral cost of everything the Nazi regime had built. Every soldier who laid down his weapon that spring faced the same haunting realization. The enemy was not what they had been told. And in the distance, as the Allies continued their advance toward the heart of Germany, the civilian world began to reawaken, hungry, scarred, but watching. When the German army finally began to collapse, surrender became not just inevitable, it became a flood. In towns and fields across western Germany, tens of thousands of soldiers threw down their weapons, stepping out of the forests and ruins with white claws tied to sticks. For many, this surrender was not an act of courage, but a desperate plea for survival. They had heard the whispers from the Eastern Front of Soviet vengeance, of villages burned, and men executed without trial. The Red Army's advance was relentless and merciless, driven by years of suffering under the German invasion of 1941. In the East, surrender meant death. In the West, there was still a chance at life. And so, German soldiers began to seek out the Americans. By April 1945, U.S. forces had captured more than 5 million German soldiers. Never before in history had so many men surrendered so quickly. American commanders were forced to improvise, transforming open fields into makeshift prison camps. Barbed wire stretched across farmland. Entire meadows became holding areas for thousands of captured men. The U.S. Army called them temporary enclosures, vast open-air cages where soldiers waited to be processed, interrogated, and relocated. Yet what astonished the captured men most was not the conditions. It was the treatment. They were not beaten. They were not executed. They were counted, fed, and guarded. The Geneva Convention was followed with precision, even when resources were strained. U.S. military police enforced strict discipline among their own troops. No abuse, no revenge, no exceptions. For the German prisoners, this discipline was disorienting. Many had grown up believing that mercy was weakness. Under the Nazi regime, compassion had been branded as treasonous sentimentality, something unfit for a master race. And yet, the Americans embodied it openly, without hesitation. This moral contrast struck deep. Reports from captured officers described an enemy that treated them with professionalism, even courtesy. In letters and diaries recovered later, many German POWs confessed their confusion. The Americans treat us better than our own commanders ever did. For U.S. soldiers and civilians, this restraint was not always easy. The atrocities of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen were beginning to come to light. Film reels of emaciated corpses and mass graves horrified the world. The instinct for vengeance stirred naturally in the hearts of those who had lost friends and family to Nazi aggression. Yet the American command structure, from Eisenhower down to field officers, knew that how they ended this war would define the peace that followed. That peace, they believed, had to begin with humanity. Eisenhower's orders were clear. German civilians and soldiers were to be treated fairly, but firmly. Looting and mistreatment were punishable offenses. American soldiers were reminded that they represented not just an army, but the ideals of a nation built on justice. In small towns across occupied Germany, this policy took on a quiet, almost sacred rhythm. Civilians emerged cautiously from cellars. American medics distributed food and medicine. Children who had once been taught to fear Yankee devils now watched them share chocolate and chewing gum. Still, beneath this fragile calm, there was tension. Not all Germans welcomed their conquerors. Many refused to believe the war was over. The ruins of the Nazi propaganda machine still whispered of miracle weapons and righteous struggle. But as Allied flags replaced swastikas on city halls, the truth became undeniable. The Reich was dead, and the men who had fought for it were now prisoners of those they had once called barbarians. The civilians' reaction to these prisoners became one of the war's strangest contrasts. Some Americans, hardened by years of loss, refused compassion. Others, especially in rural areas, felt a quiet pity. They saw not fanatics, but frightened, starving men. In towns like Reimagining, Limburg, and Heilbronn, there were documented moments of unexpected kindness, moments when American civilians offered bread or water to enemy soldiers marching through. The gestures were small, but they carried immense symbolic weight. 4 German soldiers. These encounters shattered years of indoctrination. To be greeted with bread instead of bayonets, it was an emotional shock far greater than defeat. It was a collapse of everything they had been taught to believe about good and evil. The war was not yet fully over, but already the seeds of moral reconstruction were being sown. From the ashes of total war, a strange and fragile form of peace began to take shape, not through orders or treaties, but through acts of quiet humanity. And it was this humanity that would soon become a weapon more powerful than any bomb or tank the world had seen. For the German soldier in 1945, fear was not simply the fear of dying, it was a fear of being seen. For years, they had marched under the illusion of righteousness. The Reich had told them they were the bringers of order, defenders of civilization, warriors against chaos. But as the American columns rolled through shattered German towns, that illusion disintegrated in the cold light of reality. Many of these men had never seen the consequences of the system they served. They fought far from the death camps, the ghettos, the burned villages of the East. Yet now, in surrender, the full weight of their actions, or their silence, pressed down upon them. The propaganda that once comforted them had vanished. When American civilians stepped forward with offerings of bread, that mercy carried a deeper sting. It forced a German soldier to confront his humanity at the very moment he wished to hide from it. For some, it was unbearable, a kindness sharper than judgment. Accounts from captured troops described this strange emotional paralysis. A former Wehrmacht corporal later wrote, "We expected rage, but they looked at us with pity. It was like facing a mirror we could not look away from." The human psyche, shaped by years of indoctrination and violence, now faced its collapse. Soldiers who had believed they were the chosen of destiny found themselves dependent on the compassion of those they called inferior. Every loaf of bread, every shared cigarette, was a quiet dismantling of their worldview. Defeat stripped them of weapons. Mercy stripped them of justification. And that, perhaps, was what frightened them most. For the German soldier in 1945, fear was not simply the fear of dying, it was a fear of being seen. For years, they had marched under the illusion of righteousness. The Reich had told them they were the bringers of order, defenders of civilization, warriors against chaos. But as the American columns rolled through shattered German towns, that illusion disintegrated in the cold light of reality. Many of these men had never seen the consequences of the system they served. They fought far from the death camps, the ghettos, the burned villages of the East. Yet now, in surrender, the full weight of their actions, or their silence, pressed down upon them. The propaganda that once comforted them had vanished. When American civilians stepped forward with offerings of bread, that mercy carried a deeper sting. It forced a German soldier to confront his humanity at the very moment he wished to hide from it. For some, it was unbearable, a kindness sharper than judgment. Accounts from captured troops described this strange emotional paralysis. A former Wehrmacht corporal later wrote, "We expected rage, but they looked at us with pity. It was like facing a mirror we could not look away from." The human psyche, shaped by years of indoctrination and violence, now faced a collapse. Soldiers who had believed they were the chosen of destiny found themselves dependent on the compassion of those they called inferior. Every loaf of bread, every shared cigarette, was a quiet dismantling of their worldview. Defeat stripped them of weapons. Mercy stripped them of justification. And that, perhaps, was what frightened them most. Angle 2, the civilian angle, between justice and compassion. For American civilians, the arrival of German prisoners was both surreal and deeply personal. These were the men whose country had bombed London, invaded France, and slaughtered millions across Europe. The instinct for vengeance was real. Many had lost sons, brothers, or fathers in the fighting. Yet when those same civilians stood before the beaten remnants of the Wehrmacht, vengeance often gave way to something quieter, pity. In rural areas of the American-occupied zones, especially in Bavaria and the Rhineland, townspeople watched as endless lines of German POWs were marched past. These were not the mechanical monsters of wartime newsreels. They were thin, hollow-eyed, shivering men, some barely out of their teens, some limping, barefoot, their uniforms hanging like rags. American families, themselves rationed and weary from years of war, began to share what little they had. A loaf of bread, a canteen of water, a piece of fruit handed through barbed wire. It was an instinctive gesture, not of forgiveness, but of recognition. The war was ending, and somewhere in the exhaustion of victory, compassion found its way back into human hands. Not everyone approved. Some soldiers and citizens saw these acts as betrayal, softness toward an enemy that had shown none. But others saw it differently. The American Red Cross and church groups often encouraged fair treatment, emphasizing that moral strength was shown not in vengeance, but in restraint. In those moments, morality became tangible. A loaf of bread could mean far more than a weapon. It was the first sign of something greater, the slow reawakening of humanity after 6 years of madness. For the German POWs, these civilians were the first Americans they met without rifles. For the civilians, these prisoners were the first Germans they saw without arrogance. Both sides, in that instant, stepped out from behind their propaganda. And in that fragile space between guilt and mercy, something profoundly human survived the ruins of war. Propaganda had been one of Nazi Germany's most powerful weapons. For over a decade, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had shaped the minds of millions. Through newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and posters, the enemy was painted in monstrous tones. Americans, in particular, were portrayed as corrupt, violent, racially impure, and morally decadent, symbols of a decaying democracy that would destroy itself. German soldiers were told that capture by Americans meant mutilation or execution, that they would be paraded, humiliated, perhaps even shot on sight. But when surrender finally came, these lies met their most devastating opponent, reality. The silence of the Americans, their calm discipline, their refusal to act out vengeance, spoke louder than any speech or poster. It shattered years of psychological conditioning in a single encounter. Many POWs wrote later that their greatest shock was not defeat itself, but the realization that they had been deceived. The enemy they had been taught to hate was neither cool nor chaotic. It was organized, fair, and, in a way that cut deeply, moral. This discovery carried enormous psychological weight. The Wehrmacht surrender was not merely physical, it was ideological. When German soldiers were offered bread, or allowed to rest, or treated for wounds, it was not just kindness, it was a quiet dismantling of Nazism. One U.S. chaplain who witnessed these moments later reflected, "Every gesture of mercy was a sermon without words." By refusing to become the monsters German propaganda had invented, the Americans turned truth itself into a weapon. And as word spread through the POW camps, morale among German prisoners began to shift. They no longer spoke of Hitler's final victory. They spoke of surviving, of understanding, of rebuilding. The lies that had fueled the riot were dissolving, not through gunfire, but through the quiet power of decency. At first glance, mercy seems to have no place on the battlefield. Yet by 1945, the U.S. Army understood that compassion could serve a tactical purpose just as effectively as a rifle. The massive surrender of German troops presented both a logistical challenge and a psychological opportunity. The Americans could either crush their defeated enemy or convert them. Eisenhower's high command chose the latter. The decision was not purely moral, it was practical. Every surrendering soldier meant one less opponent to fight, one less village to destroy, one less American life lost. If surrender could be made to seem safe, even honorable, more Germans would choose it. Thus, discipline and restraint became weapons of a different kind. U.S. troops were briefed repeatedly. Treat prisoners firmly, but fairly. Word spread quickly through the German ranks that the Americans were not executing captives. Some prisoners even risked crossing combat lines, surrendering to the nearest American patrol rather than the advancing Soviets. The American reputation for humanity began to spread faster than their tanks. This approach also served a broader strategic vision. Eisenhower and his planners already saw beyond the war's end. Germany would need to be rebuilt, not erased. A humiliated, vengefully treated Germany could easily give birth to another dictatorship. But a Germany shown the strength of democracy, law, and moral conduct might one day become a partner instead of an enemy. And so, mercy became a tool for the peace that would follow. From the field commanders to the military police guarding camps, this policy of measured decency was enforced with iron discipline. American officers who allowed abuse or retribution faced punishment. The war might have been total, but victory, Eisenhower believed, must not be. By treating their enemies with unexpected humanity, the Americans were not weakening themselves. They were securing their future. Few figures in modern military history understood the power of restraint as deeply as General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was not a man of passion or rhetoric, but of principle. Calm, deliberate, and deeply conscious of the moral weight of war, Eisenhower's leadership defined the character of the Allied campaign in its final months. By early 1945, the American High Command faced an unprecedented dilemma: millions of surrendering enemies, a devastated continent, and a world demanding justice. Yet Eisenhower refused to let revenge dictate policy. His directives were clear. There would be no mass executions, no collective punishment, no act that would blur the line between liberator and oppressor. The enemy had chosen their fate, and the Allies would win not only by arms, but by example. Eisenhower's decision stemmed from both strategy and conviction. He had witnessed what unchecked hatred could do. The Nazis had justified their atrocities under the same logic of vengeance and national justice. The American response, he insisted, must be the opposite. The true victory, he told his staff, is not in destroying the German army. It is in proving that we are not like them. This moral clarity flowed downward. Commanders such as Omar Bradley and George Patton, each with their own temperaments, respected the line Eisenhower drew. Even Patton, known for his harsh words and fiery temper, enforced rules against prisoner abuse. To Eisenhower, discipline was the soul of the army, and mercy was its ultimate test. The treatment of POWs under his command would later become a benchmark of military ethics. Though not without flaws, overcrowded camps and food shortages did occur. The U.S. Army's adherence to order and fairness remained largely intact, even under immense strain. For Eisenhower, it was simple. How the victors behaved now would define the peace to come, and history would prove him right. War, at its core, is psychological. It isn't only fought with bullets and artillery, it's fought in the minds of men. By 1945, the Americans had mastered that battlefield as well. The German army's morale was already shattered, but what followed was a deeper kind of defeat: psychological disarmament. When German soldiers were treated with decency, it dismantled their defenses more effectively than interrogation ever could. The shock of kindness replaced the fear of violence. Soldiers who expected execution instead received water. Men who feared humiliation found themselves guarded by young Americans who offered cigarettes. The moral foundation of Nazi indoctrination, the belief in the enemy's barbarity, simply disintegrated. This was not accidental. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and the U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division understood the value of perception. Leaflets dropped over German lines often carried messages of mercy, not menace. They promised food, safety, and humane treatment to anyone who surrendered. These weren't empty words. The soldiers who surrendered discovered them to be true. The effect was immediate. Desertion rates skyrocketed. Entire units gave up without a fight. Even die-hard Nazi officers found it harder to command obedience when their men believed surrender might save their lives. But beyond the battlefield, this approach carried a deeper victory, one of ideology. By showing mercy where the Nazis had shown cruelty, America rewrote the moral script of the war. It reframed the conflict not as conqueror versus conquered, but as civilization versus barbarism. The bread handed to a starving German soldier wasn't just an act of compassion. It was an assertion of moral superiority, a psychological weapon more devastating than any bomb. The war had proven that technology could destroy nations. But in the end, it was character that rebuilt them. And as these lessons sank into the defeated German psyche, the next great chapter, the transformation from enemy to ally, was quietly beginning April 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing in on itself. The thunder of artillery that had once echoed across the Rhine was fading. Columns of German soldiers, once proud divisions of the Wehrmacht, now stumbled east and west in disorganized lines, seeking anyone willing to take their surrender. At Reimagining, the bridge across the Rhine still stood, a symbol of the Allies' unstoppable advance. The 9th U.S. Armored Division had seized it weeks earlier, shocking the German command. Now, thousands of defeated soldiers poured toward the American lines, their rifles discarded, their faces gray from exhaustion. The Americans stood ready, rifles in hand, not to kill, but to receive. Each surrendering soldier was searched, tagged, and marched away. There was no shouting, no beating, no revenge. The efficiency of it was almost mechanical. For the Germans, it felt unreal. In one recorded account, a captured sergeant from the 352nd Infantry Division later recalled, "We had been told that the Americans would execute us on sight. But when we came out of the forest with our hands raised, the soldiers just pointed us to a field. They gave us water. One even said, 'You're finished, boys. Sit tight now.' That was all." The collapse of resistance was absolute. Between the Rhine and the Elbe, entire German corps surrendered intact, hundreds of thousands of men in uniform, filing quietly into captivity. The war machine that had conquered Europe was surrendering not to terror, but to order. What struck these men most was not the scale of their defeat, but the nature of it. There were no angry mobs, no firing squads. American soldiers, many barely older than the Germans they captured, treated them with professional indifference. Some offered rations. Some simply walked past without a word. That silence was heavy. It carried judgment more piercing than anger ever could. In the towns nearby, civilians watched as these prisoners were marched past. In one village near Limburg, eyewitnesses describe how American families, many who had lost loved ones overseas, stood along the roadside. Some stared coldly. Others, unexpectedly, reached out. One elderly woman, a baker's wife from Pennsylvania who had moved to Germany before the war, was seen handing loaves of bread through the line of prisoners. The guards did not stop her. They simply looked away. The act was not grand or symbolic. It was human. But for the prisoners, it was terrifying. That moment captured the collapse of two worlds, the brutal mythology of Nazi propaganda and the reality of decency. Some German officers tried to maintain composure, barking orders to stand tall and show discipline. But their words carried no force. The soldiers no longer feared their captains. They feared their conscience. Every act of kindness from the Americans reminded them of the lies they had lived by, lies that had justified invasion, cruelty, and obedience. In diaries later recovered from the camps, many prisoners wrote of this emotional shock. One young corporal wrote, "I had imagined the Americans as beasts. When the woman gave us bread, I wanted to refuse it, but I could not. I felt smaller than I ever have. It was worse than being beaten." In that single gesture, the idea of the superior race evaporated. The bread became a symbol of everything the Reich had denied: compassion, equality, humanity. Meanwhile, within the U.S. ranks, discipline held firm. Soldiers were warned repeatedly to treat prisoners humanely. Any act of vengeance was punishable. Yet beneath that discipline lay a current of emotion, grief, rage, disbelief, held in check only by duty. Many American GIs had seen the camps. They had walked through Buchenwald and Ohrdruf, where piles of corpses still lay unburied. They had liberated men and women barely alive, whose hollow faces would haunt them forever. And yet, when faced with the enemy responsible, they did not turn to violence. In that restraint lay the moral climax of the war. The American war machine, forged in factories and fueled by democracy, had become something far greater than a military force. It had become a mirror, showing the world what justice looked like when it refused to imitate its enemies. Across the fields of Germany, under a sky blackened by months of smoke, mercy had become the final weapon of the war. And in those quiet moments, the exchange of bread, the silent escort to captivity, the German soldier realized that the world he had fought for was not only lost, but wrong. The prison camps along the Rhine became a landscape of reckoning. In places like Reimagining, Bad Kreuznach, and Sinzig, vast open-air enclosures stretched as far as the eye could see, seas of barbed wire and humanity. Over 1 million German prisoners were gathered in these temporary camps during the final weeks of the war. They slept on the ground beneath open skies, exposed to cold rain and hunger, waiting to be processed. But what unfolded inside those fences was not just captivity. It was confrontation with truth. For the first time, these men were stripped not only of weapons but of illusion. There were no speeches, no flags, no ideology left to cling to. The Reich was gone, its leaders hiding or dead, and the voices that had once promised glory were silent. In their place was an eerie calm, punctuated only by the sound of American trucks, the barking of orders, and the quiet murmur of disbelief. Among the prisoners were men who had once been teachers, farmers, engineers, ordinary Germans who had been drawn into the machinery of total war. Now, under the watch of the U.S. Army, they became witnesses to their own defeat. Then came the moment that would redefine their understanding of victory and morality alike, the liberation of the camps. In April and May 1945, American units opened the gates of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Flossenburg. What they found was beyond human comprehension. Piles of corpses, survivors weighing less than 60 pounds, the stench of death lingering in the air. News of these discoveries reached the prisoners' enclosures almost immediately. At first, they refused to believe it. The idea that their own government, their own army, had committed such crimes was impossible to accept. But as captured SS officers were brought through the camps, some paraded before the POWs, others interrogated on sight, the truth became undeniable. And then, something remarkable happened. Instead of responding with vengeance, the Americans allowed the evidence to speak for itself. They showed films of the liberated camps to captured German officers. They made them walk through the ruins of Dachau to see what had been done in their name. It was not punishment, it was education through horror. One German lieutenant later wrote in his diary, "They showed us the pictures from Buchenwald. I felt my stomach turn. I wanted to deny it, to say it was false. But I knew. I saw their faces, our prisoners. They could not have invented this." The impact was devastating. Many prisoners fell silent for days. Some broke down openly. Others wept for the first time in years. For them, the mercy of their captors became unbearable. It was one thing to be defeated by strength, another entirely to be forgiven by those they had wronged. That mercy illuminated their guilt with a light too bright to escape. American officers noted the transformation. The defiance that had once defined the German soldier was fading. Conversations turned from when to why. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht died quietly behind barbed wire. In the midst of this moral collapse, small acts of compassion continued to ripple outward. Civilians from nearby towns, under U.S. supervision, were sometimes allowed to bring food or clothing to the camps. Chaplains and Red Cross workers distributed supplies and comfort. To the Americans, these were administrative gestures. To the prisoners, they were incomprehensible. How could the enemy feed them after seeing what they had done? It was in this paradox, kindness after atrocity, that the emotional climax of the war reached its height. Some American officers understood the psychological power of this moment. One report from the U.S. 12th Army Group noted, "The shock of humane treatment has achieved what weapons could not. The German soldier's faith in his own cause is destroyed." This was not propaganda, it was observation. The greatest weapon in the final phase of the war was not a tank or a bomb. It was moral authority. By refusing to stoop to the level of their enemies, the Americans redefined victory itself. They demonstrated that true power does not need cruelty. It needs conviction. The transformation was slow but real. Over the weeks that followed, many prisoners began to help their guards, translating, organizing food lines, cleaning medical tents. Some even volunteered to work for the Americans after the war, laying the foundation for the future cooperation that would one day rebuild Germany. And when the first groups of prisoners were transferred to camps in France and the United States, they carried with them something far heavier than shame. They carried memory. Memory of the woman who offered bread. Memory of the soldiers who showed restraint. Memory of a world they had been told did not exist. And yet it did. By the time Germany formally surrendered on May 8, 1945, many of its soldiers had already surrendered something greater than their weapons. They had surrendered their certainty. And as the guns fell silent across Europe, a different kind of battle was about to begin. The struggle to rebuild not just cities and nations, but the very idea of humanity itself. When the guns finally fell silent on May 8, 1945, Europe was a graveyard of nations. Germany lay in ruins. Its cities bombed to dust, its leaders dead or captured, and its people starving amid the ashes of the Reich. The war that had promised 1,000 years of glory had instead brought 12 years of destruction and despair. For the millions of German soldiers now held in American custody, the fighting was over. But the reckoning had just begun. The United States faced a colossal challenge: how to manage nearly 5 million German prisoners of war without succumbing to the same cruelty that had fueled their enemy. Across the Rhine, sprawling camps stretched in every direction, barbed wire cities filled with men who had once marched under the swastika. Conditions were harsh, especially in the early weeks. The sudden surrender of so many men had overwhelmed American logistics. Food was scarce, shelter minimal, and sanitation primitive. Many prisoners slept under open skies, enduring cold and rain. Yet despite these hardships, the camps remained organized, disciplined, and, by the standards of wartime Europe, astonishingly humane. American guards enforced strict rules against abuse. The Geneva Convention remained their guide, even when rations ran low. Chaplains visited regularly. Red Cross parcels began to arrive. Every effort, within the limits of war-torn supply lines, was made to preserve the moral integrity of the victors. This discipline did not go unnoticed. German prisoners, many indoctrinated to believe they would face torture or execution, instead found themselves treated with civility. They were fed, given medical care, and even allowed to write home. For men who had lived under the brutal hierarchy of Nazi command, this fairness was disorienting. It also began to change them. In letters sent from the camps to families back in Germany, a new tone emerged. Gone was the defiance and pride of the early war years. In its place came humility, and, in some cases, admiration. Prisoners described American efficiency, fairness, and a strange kind of moral authority. "They do not hate us," one wrote. "They act as if they pity us. It is harder to bear than hatred." For many German POWs, captivity under the Americans became the first glimpse of a democratic world, one where discipline did not come from fear and respect was not demanded by force. The Americans, too, began to see their prisoners differently. The war had taught them to despise the Nazi uniform, but not every man who wore it. As the weeks turned into months, thousands of POWs were assigned to labor projects, rebuilding roads, clearing debris, even working on American farms under guard. In these small, controlled exchanges, enemies began to resemble neighbors. Farmers offered their workers food. Prisoners returned the favor with labor and gratitude. The distance between conqueror and captive slowly diminished. Meanwhile, the U.S. command saw another opportunity: education. Re-education programs were introduced in many camps. Newspapers were distributed, lectures given, and films shown about democracy, human rights, and the crimes of the Nazi regime. For the first time, many German soldiers were exposed to a version of history unfiltered by propaganda. The response was mixed: disbelief, shame, and reflection. But the seed had been planted. This moral transition was not perfect. Not every camp followed regulations flawlessly. Some prisoners died from exposure, disease, or malnutrition before the logistical chaos was brought under control. Yet, even amid these failings, the intention remained clear. The Americans sought not revenge, but restoration. By late 1945, as the war crimes trials began in Nuremberg, the prisoners heard the full truth: the scale of the genocide, the organized murder of millions. Many refused to believe it. Others broke down entirely. But through it all, the Americans held their line. They did not strike. They did not retaliate. They built a foundation, one of discipline, fairness, and moral strength, on which a new Germany could one day rise. The war had ended, but in the minds of millions, a new kind of revolution was beginning. A revolution not of guns or flags, but of conscience that by the end of 1945, Germany was no longer a battlefield. It was a lesson. A defeated empire divided among victors. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Frankfurt were rubble. Hunger and despair ruled the streets. But beneath the ruins, something unexpected began to take shape, a slow, quiet process of moral reconstruction. For the German soldiers who had surrendered to the Americans, captivity became an unlikely classroom. The camps were not designed merely to hold bodies, but to reshape minds. Re-education program continued, with films about democracy, discussions led by German-speaking officers, and access to Allied newspapers. The purpose was simple: to replace ideology with understanding. The approach worked gradually. Many prisoners who had once sworn allegiance to Hitler began to question everything. They read about the Nuremberg trials. They saw the footage of concentration camps. They learned that their leaders had abandoned them, fleeing justice or facing execution. For the first time in a generation, Germans were being asked not to obey, but to think. Meanwhile, on the outside, American occupation policy followed the same principle. The war had been fought to destroy tyranny, not to replace it. In the U.S. zone of occupation, the emphasis was on rebuilding, on order, law, and, above all, fairness. Unlike the Soviet East, where retribution ruled, the Americans sought stability through cooperation. This difference in approach would shape the world for decades to come. The humane treatment of German POWs and of civilians in the American zone became a cornerstone of post-war diplomacy. When the Cold War emerged, millions of Germans remembered how they had been treated by their captors. They remembered the bread, the fairness, the restraint. That memory carried weight. It turned potential enemies into allies. Within a few short years, the same nation that had been America's most dangerous foe became its most important partner in Europe. The Federal Republic of Germany, founded in 1949, was built not on vengeance, but on the lessons of compassion and moral responsibility that began in those prison camps. In letters and memoirs written after the war, many former soldiers expressed gratitude, not only for survival, but for awakening. "The Americans defeated us without hate," wrote one former officer. "They broke our pride with kindness, and that is something we could never have done ourselves." This emotional honesty marked a profound shift. The myth of German invincibility had crumbled, but in its place arose something far more enduring, the recognition of humanity's shared fragility. For the Americans, too, the experience left deep impressions. The soldiers who had guarded the camps and witnessed the aftermath of Nazi rule carried home lessons of their own. They had seen the extremes of cruelty and the power of restraint. They had learned that justice without mercy breeds new hatred, and that mercy without justice is hollow. The balance between them became the foundation of the post-war world order. By the early 1950s, Germany had begun its transformation from occupied territory to democratic ally. American aid flowed in through the Marshall Plan, rebuilding factories, roads, and schools. Former POWs returned to a homeland still marked by guilt, yet slowly learning how to live with its past. And through it all, the same story repeated in towns and families across Germany, the shock of being treated decently by those they had feared most. It haunted them, but it also healed them. That haunting was the silent legacy of 1945. The war had been humanity's darkest descent, and yet, in the ruins, light had emerged. Not from triumph, but from restraint. Not from dominance, but from compassion. The bread that once trembled between a frightened German soldier and a silent American woman became a symbol of something far greater than a single encounter. It was a moment a cycle of hate was interrupted, and history quietly changed its course to eye in the long shadows of 1945, when Europe was broken and humanity itself seemed exhausted. One lesson rose from the ruins, that mercy, not vengeance, has a final word in war. The German soldiers who once marched across continents under the banner of conquest found themselves facing an enemy who refused to become like them. The Americans could have answered horror with hatred. They could have repaid atrocity with annihilation. Instead, they chose discipline, justice, and restraint. It was not forgiveness, it was strength of another kind. The kind that endures when armies fade. History often measures power by victory, but true power is revealed in what the victor does afterward. The bread offered to a prisoner, the calm voice of a guard, the decision not to strike. These acts carried a moral force no weapon could match. They marked a shift from the age of total war to the fragile beginning of moral peace. And for the German soldiers, that realization was terrifying. The empire that had built itself on fear and domination was undone not by bombs, but by humanity. In the silence of defeat, they saw the truth that every tyrant fears, that compassion can outlast conquest. For the Americans, too, the war left a mirror. They had seen the worst of mankind and chosen not to become it. Their restraint became a testament that justice, when tempered with mercy, can rebuild where destruction once ruled. The moment when a German soldier accepted bread instead of a bullet was more than a gesture of kindness. It was civilization reasserting itself, fragile, trembling, but alive. In that moment, the war stopped being a story of armies and became a story of people, of how humanity, even in its darkest hour, refused to disappear. The ruins of 1945 still whisper that truth, that the greatest courage is not found in the charge or the victory parade, but in the quiet decision to remain human when the world around you has forgotten how.